Hi, and welcome to this McKnight's Workforce Development Forum. You're tuned into The Data Doesn't Lie, Unveiling the Truth About Trauma in the Long-Term Care Workforce. I'm McKnight's Executive Editor, Jim Birkeland, and I'm your moderator. Today, we're going to learn about something that might not have been at the forefront in our minds before we brought this up, and it has to do with staffing and care issues. But you better believe it really is important, as we're going to see. The principles of trauma-informed care are important to apply not only to residents, but to employees as well. You're going to become privy to some fresh, original research on this topic too, so it's an especially good time to be tuned in. Note that a copy of the new report that will be referred to is in the handout tab here, so you can go and see and download it for yourself. Also, the very last slide will have a QR code that will help you download it as well. I'll be introducing our speakers in a moment, but first we have some housekeeping matters to take care of. The slides will be available for printing out. Just go to the download bubble on your screen and print it out to follow along. Now, if you're having any audio problems, please first check the volume control on your machine. This is the most common cause of these problems. And you also have a help button to use for your own if your own troubleshooting doesn't work. Now, we will have time for a Q&A session near the end of the presentation. If you have any questions for our speakers, please feel free to tap them out and submit them directly to us, starting now, in fact. Those we don't get to in real time will be answered afterward. Now, regarding continuing education, this educational offering has been reviewed by the National Continuing Education Review Service of the National Association of Long-Term Care Administrator Boards. It has been approved for 1 clock hour. But you need to stay tuned in to this event for its entirety during the original broadcast in order to receive a certificate. You can track CE requirements through the course completion tracker, which is accessed through the last icon in the area below the open webinar panel. Once you've achieved 50 viewing minutes, a View Certificate button will display, and the required viewing duration will show a green checkbox. That's when you can view or save your certificate. A copy also will be emailed to you afterward. Now, we'd like to note that this program is made possible by support from KARE. Please visit the fine folks there at doyoukare.com. Finally, this session will be archived and available on demand shortly after this live broadcast. You can access it again, or others can experience it for the first time by simply going to the registration page to enter this studio. The URL for that is mcknights.com/051624 Workforce Development Forum. Don't worry, we'll show that to you at the end on a slide. Now, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jean Hartnett is a visionary healthcare expert in trauma-informed care and adverse childhood experiences. She has more than 30 years of executive experience serving the older adult population. That's included work as a healthcare executive, college professor, consultant, and strategic advisor for large and small health systems across the United States. Katie Roan is the Senior Vice President of Hero and Employee Experience for KARE. She oversees programs and research aimed at understanding and addressing heroes' needs so they are considered in every aspect of care. In addition, she oversees KARE's own employee organizational strategy. Well, Katie, I know we have some really fresh research, as I said, as part of today's presentation. How exciting is that to have out?
It is. We are thrilled to have it out. It's great to be back here, Jim. Our first report and our first set of data was just released this week, so the timing of this is perfect.
That's right. You may have seen that, folks, in our McKnight's Daily Update and Daily Briefing newsletter. So if you don't get your fill of that here today, you can read some more about it, and we'll be covering each of these installments. So hey, you sound like you're at a great jumping off point, Katie. Why don't you take it away?
Perfect. Well, thank you so much, Jim. And it's an honor to be here today. It's an honor to have Jean Hartnett co-presenting with me. And before we dive into the topic, I want to take some time to just talk about how did we actually get here today? Because I think if you would have asked me last May, if I would have been presenting on this topic in 2024, I don't think I would have answered yes to that question. But one of the things that in my role here at KARE is part of overseeing that experience of our heroes who these are licensed CNAs, CMAs, LPNs, and RNs who pick up shifts on our platform from our community partners. And so part of that experience is not only how is their interaction with our technology and our brand, but also understanding their needs and wants as a larger collective workforce, whether that's through conversations or whether that's through original research. And I often have the opportunity, I get to see the best of the best and sometimes the worst of the worst. And so last summer, you started to see some more alarming trends around mental health crises and different situations that were popping up. And in last summer in July, we were at NACA's, the National Association of Healthcare Assistants. We were at NACA's CNA Fest. And there was a speaker there, Miss Jean Hartnett, who was giving a session to a room full of CNAs on this topic of trauma and understanding your own trauma so that you can provide better care for others. And as I'm watching Jean present to this room full of CNAs, and every single individual's head was nodding. Afterwards, they were coming up to Jean and saying, gosh, I never knew this was why I am the way I am. And I said to Jean, I goes like, we've got to dig into this further. Like this is definitely something that we need to understand, particularly when thinking about this workforce, thinking about the trauma that not only they've been through from the COVID-19 pandemic. And so that's when we had the opportunity to form our partnership between KARE and Radical Sabbatical. So Jean, I want the audience to understand that you've been in their shoes before. And how would this have helped you in how you led when you were an administrator?
Oh my goodness, Katie, gosh, what a great question to kick us off. What comes to mind immediately is that if I would have been a trauma-informed manager and leader when I was managing skilled nursing facilities, assisted living communities, and memory care communities, this ideology or this philosophy or this knowledge of trauma would have been an absolute game changer for me. And I'm pretty confident that those that are on with us today and that will listen to this recording later, that once they have this information about trauma-informed care, it is going to be a management and leadership game changer for them too. It's going to move people into action, both from a professional standpoint and a personal standpoint. You and I have talked offline so much about how our framework around all of our relationships, whether it be relationships at home or relationships that we have in the community or relationships that we have when we show up at the workplace, that having trauma information really reframes all of those relationships in such a positive way. And, as I mentioned, I did start out in the long-term care profession, eventually becoming an administrator. But my first love was when I was a certified nursing assistant, all the way back in 1989, when I started at a skilled nursing facility, kind of as my part-time job, as I was getting my bachelor's in social work. And it was there that I literally fell in love with our profession. The bathing, the dressing, the toileting, the feeding, all of those unsavory tasks that we perform on the front line, I just literally fell in love with. So when it came time to decide kind of what was I going to be when I grew up, there was no question in my mind that I was going to work with older adults. And so I just want to take time to thank you and thank KARE and McKnight for just, embracing this concept of trauma-informed care and having such an immediate connection and wanting to dive into the topic more deeply.
Well, Jean, I have learned so much from you. And like I've said before, it's changed a lot of how I look and how I look at individuals and how I lead. So let's go ahead and dive into this topic for everyone else. So it is estimated that 90% of residents have had at least one traumatic event in their lifetime. And trauma-informed care, which is a regulatory requirement that Jean's going to be talking about here shortly, really focuses on providing care that flips the focus from what is wrong with you to what happened to you. So we take this lens of care for residents, why aren't we doing that with our frontline staff? So I really hope that throughout this presentation and at the end, that this is something really thinking about, what happened to you is a frame of reference that leaders can really come away with.
Katie, that's so true. The lens of trauma really does shift that focus from what's wrong with you to what happened to you. And again, I know that managers and leaders that are on the call today are also going to have that reframe occur for them. And one of the things that I know in kind of going on my own trauma healing journey is that individuals that have survived trauma are bearing an untold story inside of them. So this quote by Maya Angelou, that there is no greater agony than bearing an untold story inside of you, is one of those guideposts that I have in front of me nearly every day, to really think about ways that managers and leaders can not only start to tell their own untold story, but also tap into those untold stories that are occurring in our residents and our families and our frontline team members. And as we go through this presentation, we are really going to see that first step of becoming trauma aware and bringing what Brene Brown calls bringing that shame into the light, because that is where it dies. Being able to talk about our trauma is really the first step in unlocking our trauma and beginning to heal from it. I think it's important to kind of tell everyone how we're defining trauma. So the definition I like to use is that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event. And one of the things that I found so interesting in researching trauma is that the word trauma originates from the Greek word meaning wound. So all of us in long-term care are very familiar with wounds. We are really vigilant in trying to prevent what we now call pressure injuries on our residents. And we know that wounds have certain characteristics. They're either red and raw and painful to the touch, or wounds can be older wounds where they're calloused over and like a scar, and there's no nerve endings in them. And I like to think of that analogy when I'm thinking about trauma healing and trauma being a wounding of the mind. And really understanding that for some of us, our psychic wounds, our trauma, are like those red and raw wounds. They are easily triggered. Whereas for others, wounds are so buried deep inside of you that you've lost all feeling and sensation and relation to them. So I think it's just really important that people kind of have that imagery in their mind that trauma is an emotional response to a terrible event, and the word trauma is a Greek word meaning wound. And we're talking a lot about trauma right now in the long-term care space. And the reason why we're talking about trauma is that the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is requiring that skilled nursing facilities become trauma informed. Now, Katie, I share with you all the time. I fess up and I say, oh my goodness. When I first read this regulation, when I was a nursing home administrator, I had no idea what this language meant. I had no idea how to implement it. I had no idea how to train on it. And for sure, I had no idea how to measure the success or failure of its implementation. So everyone knows now that by now, all of our skilled nursing facilities need to be trauma informed. So the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services is basically saying that we as a care team need to understand whether or not our residents have experienced a traumatic event in their life, and then take very prescribed steps to mitigate against the re-traumatization of a resident. And, I absolutely give the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, an applause in bringing this regulation forward, because it's where I learned about trauma-informed care initially. But I have to offer some criticism, as I usually do, of the CMS, to say that I think that this regulation is a little short-sighted. And the reason why I think that is because I know that in order to identify trauma in others, we as individuals on the care team need to understand and identify with our own trauma and be on a path to healing in order to then turn around and offer trauma-informed care to our residents. So I like to say in a joking manner that the trauma-informed care regulation in long-term care is actually not trauma-informed. And I wonder, Katie, if you could help us maybe understand a little bit more about kind of what trauma is and how trauma manifests all the way back into childhood by talking a little bit about the Adverse Childhood Experience Study.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think before I even get into the original Adverse Childhood Experience Study that was done in the mid-90s, which is really the foundation of a lot of what we're talking about, but it was also the foundation for our trauma and resilience study that we did recently at KARE. And the whole goal of our research study was to understand some of the deepest experiences that our care force is facing within long-term care, with the ultimate goal of how do we understand the past while building and creating and retaining a more resilient workforce into the future. So our three-part study sought to understand, one, the prevalence of childhood trauma or adverse childhood experiences among the care force. Two, the impact of childhood trauma and the trauma from the COVID-19 pandemic on their physical and mental health and workplace well-being. And then third was their current realities surrounding their social determinants of health, such as housing insecurity, food insecurity. And so this study was fielded in January. It was fielded to all of our care users or heroes on our platform, along with the members of the National Association of Healthcare Assistants. We had approximately 1,100 individuals who completed this study. So we were overwhelmed by the amount of data that we received, that we are releasing the results of this in a three-part report, with the first report, which was released just this week, really focused around the adverse childhood experiences. So to talk a little bit more about what is adverse childhood experiences. So these are potentially traumatic events that occur within childhood between birth to 17 years of age. Now, I'm not talking about a traumatic event of failing a big test or not getting picked for a youth select baseball team. I'm talking about traumatic events that leave a biological lasting impact on the body into adulthood. And the original ACEs study was conducted over a 2-year period from 1995 to 1997 by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente, which collected data across 17,000 individuals in Southern California. And there are many experts that have described ACEs as one of the single greatest unaddressed public health threats facing our nation today. And I'll tell you that ACEs is something that a lot of individuals, you would think, and you're going to learn at how widespread and how common this is, yet not a lot of people know about it. So as part of the ACEs questionnaire, there are 10 questions that span across 3 different categories. So the first is abuse, so physical, emotional, or sexual abuse. There we go. Neglect, so physical or emotional neglect. And then also household challenges, such as, was there a parent that struggled with substance abuse, or a parent that was incarcerated, or struggled with mental illness, or perhaps were you in a household with divorced parents as well too. So in each one of these 10 questions, is if you answer yes, you receive 1 point as your score. So you can have an ACEs score from 0 to 10. And I would recommend, and everyone on this call, you can go out, you can look up the ACEs questionnaire, and you can go and you can take this yourself. Everyone on this call has an ACEs score. We're going to talk a little bit about how that score can give you a unique lens into your health and well-being. Now, what we know is that ACEs can definitely increase risk for chronic health conditions such as heart disease, stroke, diabetes, obesity, increase in mental health conditions and substance abuse disorders with depression, alcohol abuse, tobacco usage, opioids. Also an increase in health risk behaviors, such as excessive alcohol use, substance misuse, even increase in suicide thoughts and behavior. And then it can also lead to social outcomes such as unemployment and less than a high school diploma. Now, Jean, can you tell us how these conditions increase as the number of adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs, increases for an individual?
Yes, absolutely. And thank you for that thorough overview of ACEs. And, when you say, I just want to call out before I get into the statistics that, people that are listening and understanding ACEs for the first time may be looking at those categories and really internalizing those categories. And remembering back that some of the things that you mentioned, Katie, may have been occurring in their own lives. And so I want to tell everyone, as we've told each other, is that we are very appreciative and very sensitive to just how impactful this topic can be when it's first discussed. And so when people have an ACEs score of 4 or more compared to those individuals that have 0, they are 10 times more likely to use injectable drugs, 7 times more likely to be alcoholic, 3 times more likely to engage in risky sexual behavior, 3 times more likely to binge drink, and 2 times likely to be a current smoker. But it doesn't stop there. Those are kind of the health impacts that we can see in individuals that have an ACEs score of 4 or more. But from a mental health condition, this is really staggering that those with 4 or more ACEs are 30 times more likely to attempt suicide, 5 times more likely to have depression, and 11 times more likely to be diagnosed with a certain type of dementia. So I think those are just really important statistics for people to know because, there was a physician by the name of Dr. Block, who was the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics. And he said that ACEs is one of the single most unaddressed public health threats in our society today. And those statistics that I just laid out for us really demonstrate how and why knowing your ACEs score can really mitigate against some of these public health threats.
And I think it's important that we can't talk about ACEs without also talking about what happens to the body during that period of what we're calling toxic stress. So I want to take some time to talk a little bit about that. And what happens during critical periods of childhood development, if there is not protection from nurturing caregivers in a safe environment, the consensus of scientific evidence demonstrates that repeated adversity that happens over and over again in childhood during this developmental period causes what the toxic stress response. And what happens is that this toxic stress response can cause long-term disruptions in brain development, immune and hormonal regulation systems. It can over time, leading into adulthood, it can limit a person's ability to process information, to make decisions, being able to interact with others. and also being able to regulate their own emotions. So, Jean, is there anything else on toxic stress that you want to add in here?
I do. It strikes me, even though I know a lot of this, just hearing you talk about the toxic stress response system, what you're basically telling us is that trauma changes your brain. So it changes the way that we think and the way that we behave. And there's one thing we need to be doing all of the time in senior living communities is thinking. We need to be thinking clearly and thinking critically. So just imagine what it's like to be in the shoes of our team members that have 4 or more ACEs, and they're coming to our communities in this toxic stress activation. Um, Now, with this information, could administrators and directors of nursing, I speak to them, specifically since I was an administrator and my DON just was my partner in managing all of these issues. Can we start thinking about the med error rates that we have, or the fall rates that we have, or the nosocomial infection rates that we have a little bit differently now that we know that some of these quality measures could be linked to the way that our employees are showing up in our communities?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think it's important to not only, we're talking about toxic stress right now at this moment, and what we know is that stress on a continuum is that not all stress is bad. There's different, we want to say, levels of stress here that we're going to talk about. So obviously there's positive stress that individuals experience. Like, for example, Jean and we are under a positive stress right now, like giving a webinar.
Oh, yeah.
We have brief elevations, stress hormones, heart rate, blood pressure is risen. There's also tolerable stress, where this is a time limited response to a situation. Jean and for example, we live in Nebraska, and we just had horrible tornadoes that came through, and there was a lot of individuals that were under tolerable stress at that time, but they're going to be able to recover from that event. And then there's toxic stress, which this can become biologically embedded within your body. And so the toxic stress is really what we want to talk about here. And when you look at when we look at how we categorize ACEs score with that risk level of toxic stress, if an individual has 0 ACEs, they are at a low risk of toxic stress and some of those other disease and social outcomes that we talked about. If an individual has an ACEs score of 1 to 3, they're at that medium or intermediate risk level. And then if someone is at 4 or more, which was considered high risk, a lot of what Jean has recently talked about, that is where you see then someone's at a high risk of toxic stress. So you're going to have different individuals. I'm going to talk about next how our data shows how that distribution is amongst the workforce. But Jean, how could this different levels of toxic stress show up within a community?
I love that question. And, let me start by saying that you're right. Not all stress is bad, but stress becomes a real problem when our employees are coming to our community with 4 or more ACEs. And what that means is that they are on high alert all of the time. We are biologically wired to scan the environment for danger. So we can either fight, flight, freeze, or fawn from that danger. But when you are in a toxic stress level all of the time, you are literally scanning the environment and putting yourself on high alert to react to situations that make you feel as though you need to fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. A person with toxic stress is unable to switch off that response. So any little thing that happens has the potential to feel dangerous to them. So when you mention kind of at the top of the call that you've seen the best of the best and the worst of employees, is that we can now understand that when we're seeing the worst of the worst, when our employees are acting out in really destructive ways, and our residents too, that there is nothing in the traditional management and leadership toolkits that I have ever experienced that taught me how to manage that up until now that I'm understanding trauma better. And
Mhm.
so I think it's just a real, again, I'll use the word game changer for individuals to now look at their employees just a little bit differently.
Oh,
I wonder if we could look at those specific data sets as the ACEs score applies to our workforce. Do you have any information
yes.
about that?
Yeah, so great segue, Jean. So what we did is, so as part of the study that we conducted, so we wanted to look at compared to the U.S. population, so the data that's collected by the CDC, compared to then the CARE force. So through the study that we recently conducted, so 64% of the U.S. population has at least one type of ACE. Okay. Our care force is 73%. So think about that. So we have 27% of the care force that has a ACEs score of 0 that are low risk of toxic stress. And we have 73% that are at that medium to at least high risk. Now, one of the data points that was most, I would say, kind of shocking was the 4 or more types of ACEs. So the US population, 17% have 4 or more, but among our care force, it's double. It's 34%. So when you look at that distribution then of low, medium, and high, you've got 27% 0 ACEs score low. You have 39%, which is at that medium to intermediate risk of toxic stress. And then you have 34% that is at high risk. Jean, so now thinking about, okay, this is now what the workforce looks like in regards to their kind of toxic stress levels. How would this have impacted maybe how you would have managed and led if you knew this information?
Another great question. And, I think that my initial reaction, my gut reaction is to say this would have been a true wake up call for me, Katie. I think that when I was an administrator, I was always chasing that elusive culture, that perfect culture for our employees to come into every day into our communities and feel really like they could operate as their authentic selves. And I was lacking this data of first the knowledge of understanding trauma, but then the data around how ACEs plays out in our workforce. It makes me feel, I have some guilt that I didn't have this information. And now I know that employees are coming to our skilled nursing facilities and assisted living communities not able to think clearly. But, even more important than that is that they're coming to our communities not feeling safe. And that's not because of anything I was doing or current management and leadership in communities are doing right now, but it's because they naturally show up in this world, again, in that high toxic stress activation level. And to me, seeing these statistics, I'll say it again, is a real wake up call to bring the notion of community back to our nursing homes and assisted living communities where
Yeah.
employees really feel like they're coming home, or coming to a place where they can heal through their trauma.
Yeah. And these are just a couple of really key data points from the research study that we did. The actual full report, which I encourage everyone here to download that report. And actually, what we go through each one of the ACEs questions, and we have key insights, and in regards to this particular question is, second highest amongst a certain license type or whatnot. We even looked at it just from an overall perspective. I think one of the things that was really surprising is that the average ACEs score that was highest amongst license type was actually RNs. And I think that that's something that most individuals wouldn't necessarily expect, just because that role is it's more, there's more education, it's higher paid, etc. But like I said, the data that we have in the full report gives a much kind of deeper lens into certain aspects of the care force in regards to some of the specific ACEs questions. So Jean, I've seen you, I actually saw this slide when you presented at CNA Fest. And I think it's a very powerful visual for how someone can understand ACEs.
I agree with you. And I designed it specifically for that purpose. We've all seen this picture, and I think it's been mocked up in a million different ways. But this is my interpretation of what the iceberg and the ice beneath the surface looks like through the lens of adverse childhood experiences. And people can apply this to basically anyone they know. But for our call and purposes today, I really like us to focus on our employees and our families and our residents that we care for. And it's really looking at that red arrow, and that really represents what we know about a person, what they put on their job application, what they put on their resident application, what they tell us as we're interviewing them as new residents in their social histories, and what employees tell us during the interview. And then, that's all the things that we're able to see. And that blue arrow is kind of getting right at the surface of the water. And it may be those things that some people might know about an individual, kind of those things that have happened in their lives that could be considered traumatic events. But many of us, and going back to that story, or going back to that quote rather, that Maya Angelou says that there's nothing worse than bearing an untold story inside of you. That's really getting to that yellow arrow on what we really should know about an employee and about our residents and our families before they move into the community, so that we can really provide holistic services and supports to wrap around our employees and wrap around our residents, so that when the coping mechanisms that people use to cope and soothe from their trauma are no longer working, and we're seeing those behaviors in our employees that we just don't understand, we're seeing those behaviors in our residents that we just don't understand, we would already have a knowledge of it if we get curious about what is actually occurring with an employee and with a resident when they're behaving in a way that we don't recognize.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jean, I want to go to this next exercise that you've recently done, that you shared with me, that I think has been so powerful, that you recently did in California with directors of nursing. Can you tell us more about this?
Yeah, I will, Katie. And I love that you teed it up by talking about the report that KARE did. And, we think about, oh gosh, I bet ACEs only happens in frontline team members. I bet ACEs only happens in individuals that haven't gone to college. I bet ACEs only happen in individuals who are in a certain tax bracket, like the lower tax bracket. But I'm here to tell you, qualitatively, if you bring the quantitative data from the study, I'll bring you the qualitative. So I had a hunch that our leaders in our organizations are also experiencing a great deal of trauma. So I had an opportunity to speak to all of California's skilled nursing facilities, directors of nursing. And I tried out some new material in that keynote presentation where I started telling my own story, and really weaved in kind of the things that happened to me in my adolescence and in my young adulthood that really made an impact on my life. And so I weaved that story through trauma information, and at the end started to invite the clinical leaders to start telling their own stories. So on their tables was this sheet of paper that basically said, I am a person who, and 5 or 6 lines where people could start writing what had happened to them that they haven't told anyone before or told very few people. And the idea is that once everyone had an opportunity to write their story, I would read 3 at a time at the podium and then invite the audience to stand up and to demonstrate that people don't have to go it alone, that community can be built right here, right now, among our peers. And some of the things that the directors of nursing shared with me, Katie, is that they do have high ACEs scores. Some of them admitted to and wanted us to bear witness to the fact that they had experienced sexual violence, that people feel lonely in a crowd, that people feel guilty that they were able to save other people's parents during COVID, but they couldn't save their own. There was one person that wrote down that her mother died in childbirth, giving birth to her, and she doesn't have a picture of her mother. Just these things that were just incredible. So after reading 3 of these, I invited the audience to stand up, to show support, to say, we're going to stand by you in this pain and get and on your path to healing. And nearly every single time, everyone stood up in that audience. And it was just a really powerful event.
Yeah, it sounds like it. I wish I could have been in the room. Now, Gina, I think obviously you going through that exercise and really building that community, but I think one of the things that I want to spend some time on here is that, we obviously have painted a pretty, some you can view it as potentially a bleak, maybe reality of some of the challenges of our workforce, but that's really not the end of the story. It's only the beginning. So I want to talk about these different practices that leaders and organizations can do as a part of really understanding this and how to best build and retain their workforce. I think first and foremost for me, number one has been leadership awareness. I am, for me going through this process, and I have had so many light bulb moments that has came on for me as a leader, whether that's talking with other leaders, talking with team members, talking with my family members, right? Knowing this information and knowing how this can show up in an individual is key. Is first, number one is that leadership awareness.
I absolutely agree with you, Katie. And what a perfect audience to be talking about leadership awareness, talking to this McKnight's audience today. And I do agree with you. I do believe that people's light bulbs are going off, both from their professional standpoint and their personal standpoint, of starting to say to themselves, oh, that's why. And it's just such a, again, not anything that we learned when we became nursing home administrators or went to nursing school or became an activities coordinator. None of this has ever been shared with us before. And I love the fact that KARE is really grabbing a hold of this, because trauma information is in other sectors. It's in our school systems, in our juvenile justice systems, and in our prisons. And so what KARE is allowing Radical Sabbatical to do, my company to do, is to bring this leadership awareness to the long-term care profession. And I really do think it has the power to really help our profession evolve in a very positive manner.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Community services and programs, there are a lot, whether it's at the at a state level or a local level, like there are a lot of programs out there that are dedicated to providing resources and services, around ACEs. But Gina, are there specific services or programs that individuals can use within their own community?
That's such a great question. And usually what I do is I point individuals to the 211 number. 211, just like a 911 or a 411 number, is a resource for individuals that are having all sorts of challenges, whether it be food insecurity or housing shortages or transportation issues. Managers and leaders, on behalf of their employees, or they can give this information to their employees, just simply dialing 211 can really start a person on a journey of connecting all of those things that they would need if they are struggling with trauma or struggling with an ACEs score. I'd also like to really encourage our managers and leaders to take a case management approach to our employees. And what I mean by that is just like we do with our residents, kind of with the big MDS that we do upon admission and when there's a significant change. Can we look at doing case management with our employees so that when they're first hired, we really understand what their care plan could look like, if you will, as they are working in our facilities?
I want to talk about, so I think that's a great point and segue into also having a strong mental health and EAP. Our last study that we did on benefits in our benefits white paper, we asked to not only to the care force what non-traditional benefits that they want, but we also asked that to communities as well too. And one of the greatest disparities was mental health support, and where the care force wanted it, I think it was around like 25%. Agreed to it, were only 12% of the community. So there was a really big difference between a care force saying, "Hey, we want mental health benefits," and it being more, I say, devalued, right, by the communities. And so that is something that we know. We know that this population, that they want mental health support. We also know from our study as well too that 65% of those that took the survey have never received mental health support. So I think that's really looking at what are you offering from a mental health and also from an employee assistance program as well too.
I love that, Katie. KARE has such rich data that, all of the studies are kind of overlapping and informing one another. From a community standpoint, or what I think skilled nursing facilities could do in this bucket, is really leverage their employee health departments. When I think about employee health, that's where we go to kind of lift the big bags of sand to see that we're lifting properly, and we get our TB tests and our COVID tests and vaccinations. But I'm wondering if we could really expand that role into more of a wellness role and a mental health role, and opening up the possibility of doing depression screens for our employees, and really kind of understanding from a mental health perspective what they might bring or what they might be bringing to our communities. And I think this can obviously be an opt-in situation, that these are services or assessments that an employee health department manages. It doesn't have to be mandatory, of course. But I think it really does two things. It kind of destigmatizes the fact that our employees may be challenged with mental health, but it also connects them to the services that they may need.
Yeah. And then lastly, I won't spend too much time on the positive workplace well-being, because we're actually going to be talking about this in our second report, because part of this data is, again, it's all building upon each other. But we will be talking specifically about the impact of this trauma and the impact on an individual's perception around their workplace well-being. So I'm teeing that up. Those will be that report will be released here Actually, the next two will be released in the upcoming months. But I know we have questions coming, so we're going to go ahead and continue here. We have a couple more slides, and then we're going to wrap up.
Yeah, thanks, Katie. I just want to leave everyone with this quote by Dr. Sandra Bloom. She's an individual who is working diligently to bring trauma to workplaces in order for them to be trauma informed. And she talks about that we can create trauma-informed workplaces that offer a sanctuary of safety and support, and that our long-term care communities can really be places where people can bring their whole selves and be valued for who they are. And that's my goal with Radical Sabbatical and working with KARE, is to morph our skilled nursing facilities into these sanctuaries of support.
Okay, wonderful. Well, I want to, as we wrap up here, this is another place that you can get the full report of our part 1 of our trauma and resilience series. So if you want to scan this QR code, but I also know that it is in the handout section as well too of this. But like I said, this is for the first one, and then the next two will be coming out here shortly. So Jim, I know we have a bunch of questions here in Q&A, so I'd like to turn it back over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Just outstanding material, as I knew that this was going to just be riveting and very interesting. And we do want to get to as many questions as we can here. So folks, if you care to send them in, please tap them out, and we will get to as many as we can. And Katie, I just want to reiterate, I think you answered it since the question came in, but we've had people ask, where can we find a 3-part report? And to clarify, It's really a 1-part report right now, right?
Yes. So it is the first report has been released. It's a series of 3. The next 2 will be coming out, but the first report is by scanning this QR code that you see right in front of you, or in the handout section as well.
Okay, outstanding. Now, excuse me, Jean. Jane has a good question and asks what we should know. How and when would you suggest eliciting this information from an employee? How do you overcome employee rights to privacy, resistance to sharing information, or the risk of traumatizing a person who feels your inquiry is intrusive?
Oh my goodness, that is such a great question. And I think that the way I will answer it is to start out slowly with the information. I kind of call it, Jim, the drip, drip, drip of information, that you're really presenting the material about trauma from an academic standpoint. And it's important that leaders and managers, once they kind of break the ice with this is what trauma is, and that 90% of the people we care for likely experience trauma, and then moving into kind of those untold stories that managers and leaders, if they're willing to share, can begin to share that. And that really allows for the environment for other people to share. The other thing I would mention is kind of what we've been saying all along, is that trauma is ubiquitous, meaning it's impacted us all. And if you want to take a topical approach to how to kind of introduce trauma into your facilities, start talking about the COVID-19 pandemic and how that was, an emotional response to a horrific event, going back to our definition, and really start unpacking that global trauma that we all experienced and that we all are willing to share around. And then perhaps from there, dive a little bit deeper if employees are willing to talk about other traumatic events that have impacted their lives.
Okay, very good. Let's get a few more if we can in here quickly. Mary Jo has an interesting question, Gina. On a post-employment health questionnaire, would it be advisable to ask about trauma, depression, etc.?
And a post-employment questionnaire, I don't know that I would, Jim. And the only reason why I say that is that I don't know why a person would want to know that after the fact. I would say on a pre-employment, there's again questions that employers can present to their team members that are optional questions? Or could they do a survey that's anonymous, like KARE did, where these questions are asked? And then once you have the results, really start putting those policies and practices in place that address the people that have experienced trauma.
All right, very good. This is a very good question from Jeffrey. Many of us in LTC are dealing with unresolved trauma, or many folks, I don't want to say that this was, he was saying himself, from COVID, and it's a huge issue. Have you researched this?
Well, KARE is. So KARE, as Katie mentioned, KARE is in one of their 3 reports. I think it's the second report, is going to really be looking at how COVID has impacted our workforce from a trauma perspective. And I will tell you also, back to that Director of Nursing conference, one of the exercises I did, in addition to the Stand By Me exercise, was doing small breakouts where people could get together and talk about what they learned and what they lost during COVID. And part of trauma healing is being able to hold 2 really different concepts in your head at the same time and have them be true. That's how we get away from the black and whiteness of, this is bad and this is good, by being able to say, gosh, I both lost and I learned during COVID. So that's just kind of a community level exercise that people can do to start processing that event.
All right, very good. I think we have time for another one here. Tina asks, how do you market your facilities to reflect that they are a trauma-safe facility?
Oh my goodness, what a beautiful question. And it's something that I say quite a lot, in that it's not necessarily the marketing, if you will, but being aware or being ready for when individuals come to us and say, I'd love to work with you, or I'd love to work for you, but I've got to know whether you're trauma informed. And what I mean by that, Jim, is I think our employees are starting to get really attuned with what trauma is. Many of our employees are Gen Z and Gen Ys. I call them the emoji generation. Those are the people who want to send a smiley face or a thumbs down and really kind of tap into their emotions. So they will be coming to you and asking in the future, are you a trauma-informed organization? Now, to say that you're a trauma-informed organization, what I would caution from a marketing perspective is how you are validating that. How are you, and what steps did you go through in order to become a trauma-informed organization? Because there are certain steps, and it's a process for organizations to truly call themselves trauma-informed.
All righty, very good. Now, we have the hardest question, as I always say, and one that has to be very crystallized. So many great points you guys have brought out today. If there's one thing you have to have the listeners leave today's presentation with, what would that be? And Kate, I'm sorry, Jean, I'll go to you first on this one.
Oh my gosh, that is such a great question. Jim, I would say that ACEs is not destiny. This idea that we all have had childhood trauma or may have 4 or more ACEs and, oh my gosh, my life is over. Well, it isn't. You being here on this call and learning more and really understanding kind of what ACEs is, there is a process of healing that a person can go through where they can kind of reconcile their ACEs score and mitigate against all of those mental and health conditions that may occur. I authored a workbook that's on my website, www.radicalsabbaticalcare.com. And I call it the Gene's Greatest Hits. And it's 67 pages of all the things that I learned and wrote about and felt in my body in order to heal from trauma. So that would be one reason. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there, but I was going to ask Katie your one thing that you had to have from her.
Go have a conversation with someone else about what you learned today. that has been something that through conversations after learning about different parts of ACEs and having a conversation, whether it's with a team member or a family member, it will start to open up so many conversations and so much learning. So go talk to someone about what you learned today.
All righty. Well, very good. Folks, I hope you've enjoyed this as much as I have. As I said, this is where you can find this in archive for another next 12 months. You or if somebody needs to go in to see it for the first time, they can. We want to give our special thanks to Jean Hartnett and Katie Rohn for some excellent thoughts today. And we also like to thank our session sponsor, KARE. Check them out at doyoukare.com. And we want to thank you, so many listeners. Been a big part of success today with some excellent questions. Once again, thank you for tuning in. We look forward to seeing you again at all future McKnight's events and webinars. This is Jim Berkland for McKnight's, wishing you good health and outstanding days ahead.